Good evening, everyone. It's just 7, and so we're going to get started. Um, we will have to readjust the mic when Dr. Wright comes forward. Um, uh, First of all, Karen and I are very pleased to have you here with us tonight. A little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to ask you to turn off your phones and other distracting devices. We do have a very full house. If we need to get out of here quickly, there's a door in the back there, and the big wooden door is also functional. I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then I'm going to ask help for those of you who can to kick the back of your chairs and lean them up. I'll be moving chairs. I'm not rushing you out. I'm just giving us room to move around and visit. And after the talk, the books and the cookies, homemade cookies, and lemonade are in the front. Now, for those of you who come to a lot of our events, you will notice the switch from winter cider. This is the first lemonade event. We have an amazing calendar full of just poetry and novelists and all sorts of people coming between now and counting the readings in Canaan in July, and I encourage you to check our website. I do have the May calendar printed, but I missed the 5 poetry readings at Dartmouth that are happening next week because I didn't know about them at the time. And so tonight, we are more than honored to welcome Dr. James Wright, President Emeritus, and Eleazar Wheelock Professor of History Emeritus at Dartmouth College. He's the son of a World War II veteran, and he joined the Marine Corps in 1957 at age 17. He served for 3 years, and then he obtained a bachelor's degree from Wisconsin State University, Platteville, and a master's and doctoral degree from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He joined the Dartmouth College History Department in 1969, and from 1998 to 2009, he served as the college's 16th president, as probably most of you are all familiar with from that. He's worked with veterans since 2005, when he began visiting wounded Marines and soldiers in Washington hospitals. In dozens of visits since then, he has worked to encourage the injured servicemen and women to continue their education, and has worked on many programs to facilitate that process and been recognized for that work. In addition, he serves on the board of several VA Veterans Affairs organizations and has been widely recognized for all of his work, including being featured as Person of the Week, which I thought was an interesting award, from ABC World News. He was recognized as New Englander of the Year, a year is better than a week, by the New England Council, and he received a special Daniel Webster Award from the Dartmouth Club of Washington. He is the author or editor of 7 published books. The one prior to this one was very well received as well. It's called Those Who Have Borne the Battle, A History of America's Wars and Those Who Fought Them. Without further ado, help me welcome Dr. Wright.
That's pretty good. How's that sound back there?
Good.
More.
How's that?
Better.
Good. Thank you, Liza. Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight and to see so many friends, Karen and you. And this is a very special place, this bookstore, one that contributes much to the intellectual life of the Upper Valley. And Susan and I are grateful to Penny and Liza for their commitment to doing just this, to having more than a store. Over the last couple of weeks, in conjunction with this book, we've been out to several independent bookstores and value so much what they represent and provide. And I want to say this bookstore does it as well as any of them do it. So as a special salute, we come to Independent Bookstore Day, a day to acknowledge those things that we should think about every day of the year. So thank you for what you do here. Now, I won't surprise you when I say that I enjoy talking about my book. I hope very much that you will read it and enjoy it. But more importantly, I hope that you will learn something from it. So let me tell you what it's about. Let me tell you what it is that I'm trying to accomplish here. Last year in New York, Susan and I attended a performance of Hamilton. Many of the lines in that play struck me and stayed with me, but one of the lines kept running through my head. Eliza Hamilton, the widow of Alexander Hamilton, sang along with a chorus of founding fathers, who lives, who dies, and who tells the story. Now this is relevant to my remarks because in any war, in any armed confrontation, the first questions are really the determinative ones. Who lives and who dies? Apart from all other explanations, this is the fundamental question. It's a tragic consequence. Indeed, and I think we must never forget this, killing or being killed is the cruel purpose of war. That is what war is. That's why I've had so much trouble with the boots on the ground metaphor that politicians and pundits have used over the last several years. We are not talking about shoe leather. We're talking about our young who serve. And we're asking of them who lives and who dies. But then the burden that continues after all of the shooting stops is the lingering question, who tells your story? That shared narrative of battles and wars fought is critical for the framing of the story. It provides an account of a life and other lives lost. It reminds us of who they were. And it marks forever the lives of those survivors of the war who knew them and will carry with them forever the memories. And those who serve with them will carry their own experiences as well. We all need to assist in the responsibility of carrying these stories and to make certain that they become part of our national narrative. I interviewed 160 people for this book. I call them my collaborators. And late last month, I sent to each of them a personally inscribed copy of the book to thank them for helping me. Many powerful stories are here, largely of combat experiences. And these stories affirm that in so many cruel and perverse ways, there is nothing more human than war. A place for testing values and courage, a cruel and difficult and awful place to test values and courage. One account of a family member has stuck with me a lot. This was somebody who was not in Vietnam in the military. He was a young Pennsylvania boy, about 14 or 15 years old. His brother was in the Army, and he was home one day and there was a knock at the door, and there were two soldiers standing at the front door. They asked him if his parents were home. He said no, they were out, but they just called and they'd be back in 15 minutes, and if they would like to wait for them, that would be fine. They said they would wait on the porch, and he went out and joined them. And as he told me this story 45 years later, he said, I talked to them. I was so excited to see them. I said, my brother is in the Army. My brother flies a helicopter. He's in Vietnam. He's going to be coming home in a couple of months, and I can't wait to see him. I'm so thrilled to see him. Do you know my brother? And these people, he said to them, he told me, really said nothing. And his parents came home, and they would learn that his brother would not come home. And this man remembered all these years later, running up in the woods behind their house and just weeping and weeping and weeping about the brother that he valued so much, his hero, who would not be coming home from war. Now, my book does provide a history of the war. I am a historian. This is not simply an assemblage of interviews. It's trying to tell the history of the Vietnam War, but to provide this human face for it. I do think it's important to set context and to frame the world of the Vietnam generation. I'll tell you, I'm not very kind to those who sent them to war. I'm pretty critical of them, from Eisenhower to Nixon. But I'm less interested in critiquing the nation's leaders than I am in assessing the view of the world that they stressed, at least that they stressed publicly. And I think one of the great tragedies is that personally they each had so many misgivings about what they were engaging in, but they never talked about these publicly. The world that they stressed and that the baby boom generation learned. The baby boomers, those of us remembering the 1950s, goodness, it was a time of expanding opportunity and of constant reminders, though, of doomsday. Remember the early 1950s? We were told we could do anything, but then we were engaging in duck and cover drills in our schools. To be prepared not just for a potential attack, but a likely attack. We had to be ready for that. They grew up in a world in which John Kennedy reminded them of obligation. At his inauguration in 1961, he exhorted, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Now, if this sense of shared responsibility for the well-being of the Republic seems quaint in 2017, it was not quaint in 1961. President Kennedy's generation, their parents, the baby boomers' parents' generation, talked about taking on the torch of liberty. The torch is passed to a new generation of Americans. But you know what? They very quickly passed the torch of liberty onto their children and said, now take care of it, defend it. The grand vision of this post-war world, this sense of global responsibility, this sense of a conflict around the world with godless communism, ironically played out in the jungles of Vietnam. It's almost perverse to think of the way that the steps that were taken that ended up evolved into Vietnam. One of my favorite lines about this is from Colin Powell. He served 2 terms in Vietnam, 2 tours in Vietnam. He was over there first in 1963, a young Army officer, and he was an advisor. He got over there in January of 1963. All we had on the ground then, more or less, were advisors. We'd increased the number significantly in the Kennedy years. And Powell found himself at a base camp up near the Laotian border, up in the Asha Valley. Still a godforsaken part of the world, up in the northwestern part of the old South Vietnam and near Laos. He reported in there and met the South Vietnamese commander, the head of the army unit there, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese forces. And he gave him a tour of the base camp and told him what their procedures were. And Powell said to him, "Tell me, why is this outpost here?" And the South Vietnamese commander said, "This is a very important place." And he said, "Why?" And he said, "It's here to protect this airstrip down below." And there was a modest grass airfield down below, down the slope of the hill. And Powell said, "Oh, I I see. Why is the airstrip there? And the Vietnamese commander said, it's there to supply this outpost. This sort of circular logic, Powell would later say, defined for him, as well as anything, many of the tactical operations and postings of that war. In 1965, when the American ground war began in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson sent in Marines to Da Nang in March of 1965, and that was really the beginning of the ground combat phase of the Vietnam War, the American ground combat phase. When it began, the dominant public image of those young men and women serving in Vietnam was really of heroes, of young American heroes fighting communists someplace in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It would be fair to say most Americans could not have found that someplace on the map, but they were there. Within a few years, as casualties increased significantly in Vietnam, and as the draft picked up, and more were drawn into the military unwillingly, many Americans considered those who came to consider those who were serving out there as objects of sympathy. They were out there fighting a cruel and an ill-advised war, these poor kids. There was tremendous pushback against the war, the protests that really had started in 1965. By 1967 had really gelled, and it was, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? After the story of My Lai became public in late 1969, in the minds of some Americans at least, those kids who were out in Vietnam became instead the perpetrators, not the victims, but now the perpetrators of that cruel war. They were drug-addled psychotics. Lyndon Johnson was back on his ranch, and now the kids in Vietnam became the baby killers. I think of this war, this image that evolved in the 70s as the Apocalypse Now war. I describe the movie Apocalypse Now as Vietnam meets Woodstock. Apocalypse Now may be a good movie. It is not a story of the Vietnam experience. Now, I have to say, I said this in a program a couple weeks ago in Burbank, California, and the first question from the audience, from somebody sitting near the front, was, I was a screenwriter on that movie, and it was very accurate. I chose not to argue. With notable exceptions, particularly novels by Vietnam veterans, people like Tim O'Brien and Carmel Antes and Jim Webb. And few of the popular accounts of the Vietnam War were those who served recognized for exactly what they were, scared kids. Scared kids who signed up for a difficult and a very scary assignment. I think among the many tragedies of the Vietnam War, one is that in the 1970s, more Americans would have known the name of Lieutenant William Calley, who led the Army unit that massacred the 600 civilians at My Lai, that would have known the name of anyone else who had served in Vietnam. There was tremendous heroism in Vietnam. There was courage in Vietnam. I would argue as much, probably without any way to ever substantiate or prove this, as much as in any war. But there were no publicly embraced heroes of the Vietnam War. It's hard to embrace heroes in a war that the public was not prepared to embrace. In my book, I quote from a poem that was shared with me by a sailor. This young man had been serving on a patrol boat, a swift boat, down the Mekong Delta. In April of 1969, He had watched a very close friend of his die when their boat was ambushed by enemy troops on a narrow waterway of the Delta. This was what people out in these boats expected. They were ready for it all the time, and in many ways, the American tactic in Vietnam was to invite an ambush and then be able to hit hard with greater firepower. About 80% of the contacts in Vietnam were initiated by the NLF, or the North Vietnamese Army, and really we were asking them to do this because it was our way of bringing them out, and then we could hit them hard with air power and other things. But this sailor was so deeply shaken when this friend of his was killed. And a month later, he was in Saigon on a very brief R&R. He described sitting in a hotel room there, looking out the windows and watching a storm come onto the city. He wrote in his diary, he shared with me his diary, he wrote, "The sky is black now, illuminated now and then by silent strobes of lightning. People hustling about before the storm and before the curfew. But soon the rains will come and cool us all and slow the motion. And the city will become quiet under the soothing rhythm of the rain. People will move inside and watch the monsoon downpour from a darkened window. And some, perhaps, will reflect on the day just ended. Some, perhaps, will reflect on the day just ended." It's long past time for us to reflect on the day and the years that have ended. Telling the story is a burden we share, and so I would take this occasion to share with you my effort to reflect on the days of that war, now ended for many years, and to reflect a little bit on the very human experience of the Americans who served in Vietnam. In my interviews, I found some compelling stories of those on the ground, and I tried to introduce those who died on that ground. I tell the story as told to me by Don Sullivan from Massachusetts. Sullivan was going to be a Jesuit priest. He dropped out of that and went to BC and graduated. And then he got his draft notice. And he went down to the local draft board to see what his options might be, and they sent him to the recruiting station. And a soldier there said to him, "You should become an officer. You've got a college degree, you can become an officer, you can go to OCS." And Sullivan said, "Why in the hell would I want to do that? I'd have to serve for 1 or 2 more years." And the recruiting sergeant said, "I'll tell you why. You can go to Vietnam, and you can be inside the officers' club drinking a cold martini, or you can be outside the officers' club marching on guard duty. What would you rather do?" Sullivan, not sure if he ever had a cold martini. I know he had difficulty finding even cold beer in Vietnam, but he decided to become an officer. And he was one of the men in the 187th of the 101st Airborne that went into Hamburger Hill, Dong Ap Pia, on May 10th, 1969, which became one of the major sustained battles of the Vietnam War. Hamburger Hill, the kids who served there would call it. And Sullivan was one of the few officers who went in at platoon leader level who was there to step up on top of the hill 10 days later. He told stories about it. And he told me a story of somebody that was still gnawing at him and causing him great grief and anxiety. Many years later, he told me about Buck Dufresne, a young soldier in his unit from the Twin Cities. He said Buck Dufresne was just everybody's idea of a model soldier. He went to NCO school and was a great leader, and the men respected him a lot. I think it was on the 3rd or 4th day they got orders to go up the hill again, and they got hit by a North Vietnamese rocket attack from the top. And one of the men was very badly injured. And so Buck Dufresne organized a group to put together a litter to carry him down the hill to get him medevaced out. The hill was so steep and the fire coming down was so intense that they had to get down to a clearing down below to medevac anyone out. A helicopter could not get in where they were. And so Buck Dufresne organized it, and then the people carrying the litter were hit by another rocket attack. 2 of them died immediately, including the man who they were carrying out, and Buck Dufresne was badly injured. Sullivan went down to see him to try to help him, and he was really badly injured. He said, "We're going to get you out of here. We'll get another litter. We're going to get you down to the bottom. Don't worry, Buck." And Dufresne said, "No, I'm not going to make it. I'm going to go to the promised land." And he said, "No, we're going to get you out of here." And they quickly organized the litter and put him on it and said, "We'll get you to a helicopter. You'll get out of here." And he said, "No, I'm going to the promised land." And he started singing on that litter, "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." 3 men that I talked to who were there that day remember the strength of his voice as he sang those lines. Buck did not make it to the bottom of the hill. Sullivan told me on the 8th or 9th day they got orders to go up again. And by then the men were so decimated, they said, "No, we can't do this. Tell Blackjack," this is the Honeycutt, the commander of their battalion, "tell him to go up the damn hill himself. We're not going up again." And they sat there, and Sullivan said, "I didn't know what to do. Nobody had trained me in officers' candidate school. What the hell do you do if there's a mutiny on the ground?" And one other officer said, when talking about similar situations, he said, "What are you going to do, threaten to send them to Vietnam?" So Sullivan didn't know what to do, and he went over and picked up his helmet and his equipment and started heading over toward the trail. And one of the men shouted out, "Where are you doing, Lieutenant? Where are you going?" And he said, "Our orders are to go up the hill. I want to go up the hill again." And they said, "Oh, for God's sakes, hold on." And just then there were some mortar rounds that came down from the North Vietnamese positions on the top. They didn't hit any of the men, but they hit over on the edge of the clearing where they had all of their equipment. And they ran over to see how much damage had been done there, and one of the men started sort of raging because he picked up his backpack and it was soaking wet. He'd been carrying a can of sea rations fruit cocktail in his backpack since the day they came in, because there was nothing like the sweet juice of a fruit cocktail can. And he was saving that, and he was going to drink that on top of the hill when they got there. And shrapnel from the mortar round had shattered the can, and all of the juice had drained out of it. And he said, "God damn it, let's go get those bastards." Sullivan said, "If it takes a leaking can of fruit cocktail, we'll go." He was there at the top, and then they went out to Eagle Beach, those that remained. Those units that went in the first day had 70 to 80% casualties, which is unbelievable. They went out to Eagle Beach, and he got a letter there from his mother back in Massachusetts. She said, "I've been reading in the paper lately about American soldiers fighting on some terrible hill in Vietnam." She said, "Donald, I surely hope that you've got more sense than to be up there." When they designed this book, the jacket, I asked them to put some pictures on the back of some kids who had died in Vietnam. And the guy in the front is actually, he didn't die there, it's Larry Wayne Chafin. It's a famous Horst Foss photograph of 1965, yeah?
Tell them what happened to that hill. Only a few weeks later, they gave it right back to him.
They did give it back to him. Yes, they did. And I'll be happy to turn back to that if you like, but they did 2 weeks, not even quite 2 weeks. Chafin was from St. Louis. He was 19 years old when Horst Foss took this famous photograph. The photograph is of more of this young man, but the designers used only the eyes, and I think it's very effective. He had great difficulty adjusting after he came home, and he died in 1985 of diabetes, and his family was convinced that it was something to do with Agent Orange to which he'd been exposed. But by 1985, there was no presumption of this. Sharon Lane is on the back. Sharon Lane was one of 8 nurses who died in Vietnam. She died just 6 weeks after arriving there. She was the only nurse, the only woman killed in a direct enemy attack. She was from Canton, Ohio, and she wanted to go and be a nurse and try to look after the troops in Vietnam. She was at the 312th Evacuation Hospital in July. And she spent a lot of her time there, including her free time, looking after Vietnamese in the local villages. She was killed in a rocket attack. She was killed immediately in a rocket attack. And I did interview some who were with her, and I recall the Army nurse who said that Vietnam was never the same to her after she learned of Sharon's death. Lenny Hickson, just a high school graduation picture, as a kid, he was one of a set of triplets born on the Navajo reservation. After he graduated from Window Rock High School, he joined the Army. He was a paratrooper and a machine gunner, and he was recognized by his buddies for his generosity to them and for his strength. He carried their loads when they were tired or needed help. Lenny would do it. He sacrificed his sleep to look after them. Lenny Hickson died on Hamburger Hill. One of his buddies wrote to his parents, "What a privilege to have known such a man." Lenny Hickson was buried at Fort Defiance Cemetery on the Navajo reservation. And following a Catholic funeral there, the Navajo elders performed their ceremony for this young warrior. One of his triplet sisters threw herself on the coffin and begged to be buried with her brother. Jimmy Hickey, this young Marine. Jimmy Hickey was from Quincy, Massachusetts, and there was a strong Irish-American Marine Corps culture in Quincy, Massachusetts. In fact, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford, grew up in that Marine Irish-American culture in Quincy, Massachusetts. Jimmy Hickey was going to drop out of high school in his junior year. He was just 17 with some friends because they were going to go to Vietnam. There was a war going on, and damn it, they better go. They better sign up. But he delayed. He was persuaded not to go, his family some, but really his girlfriend. And so he didn't go with his group of buddies, and the following February rather, during the Tet Offensive, one of those young kids that he was going to join with was killed in the way. And so Jimmy Hickey and 4 other of his classmates dropped out of high school a month before graduation and joined the Marines. He was in Vietnam by early 1969. He died in May of 1969. I had opportunity to interview his sister and his brother, a high school teacher, a couple friends of his, and he was just a remarkable, energetic young man. He wrote home right before he died that he missed everybody, but he was getting kind of bored. Nothing was happening there. The area where he was killed, the Marines called Dodge City. And there's a square in Quincy, Massachusetts that's named in honor of Jimmy Hickey. And at the last count, there were 19 other squares in Quincy, Massachusetts, remembering the young blue-collar men from that city who died in Vietnam. Jimmy Hickey's uncle, Phil Burns, wrote a poem, The Magic Horse, that the family shared with me and that I print in the book. When Jimmy Hickey was young, he insisted he had a magic horse, and he kept this magic horse tied up by his bed every night. His magic horse protected him and took him to wonderful places. And Mr. Burns' poem ended with the line, "Dear Jim, I'll lead you home upon your magic horse." The poem evokes Peter, Paul, and Mary's Puff the Magic Dragon. dragons live forever, but not so little boys. And then there's Michael Lydon, right here. I knew Michael Lydon. After I got out of the Marines, I worked in the mines back home, hard rock mines, and I was a powderman, and Michael Lydon's father, Clarence Lydon, was one of my bosses, one of my supervisors. Clarence was a World War II veteran had a Purple Heart from World War II. He was a good man, and I got to enjoy his son, Michael, great kid. Michael was drafted, served with the 101st Airborne with the 187, was promoted to sergeant in Vietnam, and he went into Hamburger Hill on the 10th. On the 14th or 15th of May, he was hit in the chest by a rocket-propelled grenade, which killed him instantly. I interviewed a couple of people who were with him at that time, one who covered him with his poncho to keep the flies from being all over him before they got him on the helicopter. I went over to Vietnam in late summer of 2014. I decided I really had to go over and walk the ground at some of these places that I was writing about, some of the places where men have been telling me stories about. And I covered a fair amount of ground, back out in the Delta, up in the Central Highlands, up through I-Corps, out along to Quai Son, along Highway 9. And I went down the Oshawa Valley, and I decided I wanted to climb Hamburger Hill. And that morning in the village of Aloi, I met a couple of North Vietnamese who had fought there against the Americans, and I asked them if they would climb the hill with me, and they did. It was hot and humid and slippery and steep, and I thought, my God, what have I gotten into here? And I thought, how did these kids do it 45 years ago? It wasn't enough to say they were over 50 years younger than I was. Nobody was shooting down at me. I wasn't carrying 50 to 60 pounds of equipment with me. But we did get to the top, and we rested a bit there, and I told the North Vietnamese soldiers through an interpreter, I said there's something I wanted to do before we went down. And I pulled from my pocket a little piece of lead sulfide. Lead sulfide is the cubical forms of lead. It's called galena. And I told them that I'd worked in the mines, and I picked up this piece of lead sulfide back in the mines of my hometown of Galena. And a kid that I knew from that hometown had died on Hamburger Hill. And he never made it to the top, and I wanted to bury this piece of lead on the top of the hill, so a piece of our hometown would be there. And I can assure you that lead sulfide, that galena, will last as long as the red clay of that hill will last. I spoke on Veterans Day 2009 at the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. It was a very moving experience for me, and I was very honored to be asked to do this. Standing there in front of the wall with Gold Star mothers sitting right in front of me, and surrounded by many veterans who had come to remember and to salute again. I concluded my remarks that day with this reminder, one that I guess continues to frame my engagement and objective. I said there, casualties of war cry out to be known as persons, not as abstractions called casualties, nor as numbers entered into the books, and not only as names chiseled into marble or granite. We need to ensure that here in this place of memory, lives as well as names are recorded. Lives with smiling human faces, remarkable accomplishments, engaging personalities, and with dreams to pursue. We do this for them, for history, and for those in the future who will send the young to war. And I guess in many ways trying to remember and remind about these lives has been an important part of what I've been doing for the last several years. In the play Hamilton, George Washington, the old soldier, sings alongside of Eliza Hamilton. His lines, "Let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and dreamed of glory. You have no control. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?" My book represents my attempt to contribute to the effort, to the obligation to make certain that the stories are told. I hope someday that more people can answer affirmatively the question, do you know my brother? I received an email last week from somebody who had read the book, and he said, "Thank you for writing the words that many of us combat veterans cannot speak." It is hard for combat veterans to speak, but we can encourage them to speak. We need to hear their stories. So my regards to all of the veterans here. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. But all of us, veterans and non-veterans, need to join to tell the stories and to listen to the stories and to learn from the stories. Thanking for your service is inadequate. Recording their stories is important, but it is not sufficient. Eulogy is not enough. We need to listen, we need to hear, and more importantly, we have to learn. This is the human face of war. Thank you very much. We'll be happy, Liza, to answer some questions. Have some comments? Yes.
Apologies for reading it and I missed this, but what would you say your personal relationship to Vietnam?
I was in the Marine. I was out of the Marines in 1960, so I never served in Vietnam. I'd never been in the country until I went there in 2014. I've been back since then, but I went back over to visit there. During the war years, I was in school after I got out of the Marines, and certainly by 66, 67, I joined with others in disagreeing with and in protesting the war. I did that when I came here. I took a group of Dartmouth students down to Washington in 1970 after the Cambodia invasion. But that's different. I never, in all of my protests, at least about the war, I never challenged the kids who served there. I kind of knew who they were. I may not have known them personally, but I knew who they were. I had been there, I'd been in the Marines a few years earlier, and I just had a regard.
Did you choose to write about that in this book, or did you choose to leave that out?
I do refer to it in the introduction. I do it more probably in my previous book, where I talk more autobiographically than I do here. Yeah. Yes. Hamburger Hill.
The Hamburger Hill deal, gave it right back to them.
Yeah, we did. It was.
We did that all the time over there.
Well, because the military approach, and you go back to Colin Powell, but the military approach was not necessarily to gain territory. We went into Dong Ap Pia, Hamburger Hill, because we knew that there had been a major concentration of supplies there for the NVA coming right across from Laos. And we assumed, and the Army assumed this on day one, that the guys that went in that first day said we'll be up on top by 1,400 hours. They were 10 days later, 1,400 hours, because the North Vietnamese chose to stay there and fight because they had it honeycombed enough. And once our troops were in, it was impossible to use B-52s and some of the heavier bombing armament on the hill because our kids are right up there up close. But we were trying to get them off of there and to ruin what we called their warehouse there. After we did that, we pulled out. And I think this became very controversial. Interestingly, many of the kids who fought there that I interviewed, most of them, I think, didn't said they didn't think much about it at the time. That's what they did. They went in and they fought and they pulled out. And,
I was in the A Shaw at that time.
okay, you were.
Yeah, and you could feel things moving underneath you.
Oh, it was an awful place. Well, I'd like to hear more about that, but it was, and you know, part of the, when you look at where the Hamburger Hill, where Dong Ap Pia was, you know, just a year before that, you know, 15 months before that, we were afraid that the Marines at Khe Sanh were encircled, and there was going to be another Dien Bien Phu. Lyndon Johnson wanted reports on it several times a day. He was afraid that they weren't going to get out of there. And Khe Sanh, you know, the great thing about Vietnam was the air mobility of helicopters. We could send troops any place and supply them any place, but we're totally dependent upon them. And we were not, again, I don't think, about to try to make an enclave several miles from Laos that was dependent on helicopters to come in and out for supply. So they got out of there. So then the question, it was already a controversial battle in the United States. Ted Kennedy had made a speech about it, and when the Army pulled out of there, it became even more controversial.
Because, you know, with all that fighting for, walk away from it.
But look at some of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, the wars, certainly since World War II, and Korea was complicated for the first 6 months. It was a little different. But
have you ever known anybody to win a guerrilla warfare?
Well, there's no counterpart today, and we're not likely to see it again, of an army sweeping onto the beach at Normandy and 2 months later liberating Paris, or Marines coming onto the beach at Iwo Jima and raising a flag on Mount Suribachi. Those sorts of long pitched battles are over. We didn't raise flags in Vietnam because we wanted to insist it wasn't an American war.
Thank you for writing this story. How did you pick the veterans who you spoke to? Had you met them previously?
No. A few of them I had, but not usually. I worked with the. I would like to say it was random. It wasn't, but I worked with
Jim,
the.
could you use the mic?
Yes,
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry. I worked with the VFW and the Vietnam Veterans of America, and I asked them to publicize what I was trying to do. When I started this, I was really focusing on the spring of 1969, because I do think that was a pivotal time in the war. And I wanted those who had served in combat units and had served preferably with those where there were casualties. And so my sample disproportionately are Marines, paratroopers, and Army infantry. I don't have many stories from back on the big Long Binh, the big bases there. I'm out in the bush in the high country with most of my stories here. And so some people got in touch with me. They were interested because I was trying to tell a story about some of the kids who were killed over there. And a number of people said, I've never really talked about this, but if we can tell this story, I will. And so then they would connect me with others, and this was, you know, some units have pretty active websites and other things, so I would never claim it's random, but I had a pretty good group of people.
Mike Haney, Jim.
You have your own story to tell.
I have my own story. I'm not going to tell it now. I have a short comment and then a question for you. As a Vietnam veteran, I was one of those young rifle platoon leaders in Vietnam, and a lot of your stories that you just told really resonate with me. But my comment is, thank you for your own service, but especially your service to these men whose stories you've tried to tell here. At the end of the day, that's all we have is our stories and our compassion for one another, and this is, I think, the finest thing you could have done for these guys. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Michael.
My question is, I went back to Vietnam too, a little earlier than you did, and I gained such vivid impressions that I wasn't able to. I got vivid impressions during the war too, but these were different. I just wondered, Does anything resonate with you as a memory of your trip that really kind of maybe changed your feeling or made a mark on?
I remember, that's a good question, and Michael's story of going back, the Valley News had an account of this several years ago. I think Susan Boutwell
Yes,
did it. It was really just a powerful story about going back to Vietnam, because most of the men in your platoon were killed in an ambush one day, and you wanted to go back to this place where they were killed. It's
thank you for remembering.
very moving. I remember we're sitting we'd come down from the Oshawa Valley, and we were in the Central Highlands near Dak To, I think, and I was having a beer with somebody that I was traveling with who was an Army veteran. And by then we'd covered a good bit of the country, and I said, how in the hell did anybody really think that we could, with 500,000 men, win the battle for this country? It's just impossible. I was struck by the scale of Vietnam, the topography, the difference, the complexity. I knew all of these things before, but you have to drive down some of these roads and walk up some of these trails to begin to appreciate just how complicated it was. That was one thing. Another was how friendly the Vietnamese were. I never had an unpleasant encounter. I remember you met some of the soldiers that had fought against you,
Right.
and it was,
They
it
took
wasn't
down
testy.
their
It was
wing. Yeah.
strained at first, but you,
Yep.
but now most Vietnamese, I don't know what percent of them. I mean, most Americans, 75% of Americans were born after 1973, I think, after the combat troops came out. In Vietnam, it would be even higher than that. So they don't have a first-hand memory. And I talked to some people about this, and they seem pretty relaxed. I never encountered even these North Vietnamese soldiers that climbed Hamburger Hill with me. There was no hostility there. I asked them what they learned from the battle at Hamburger Hill. They said they learned two things. One is just how tough and resolute and courageous the Americans were, because they kept coming up. And they said we also learned that we could stand and fight with them, which they had not done very often. So it was, I'm not sure which is the more compelling lesson there.
Thank you.
Yes.
I know that that President Nixon, I've heard I've seen in documentaries and read in books that during the negotiations in Paris in the war, that there was something that he did to extend the war in order to give him a better chance of being reelected or of winning the election or something like that. Do you know what I'm?
Yeah, he was concerned about his reelection. We know this, and quite frankly, any president is concerned about his reelection. Nixon was not unique. He may have been unique in some of the things that he did to secure his reelection. He was very uneasy, and he tried to announce that basically the peace agreement right before the election in '72, and there's no doubt that in retrospect they were looking for a little time. I'm not sure that they really thought that the South Vietnamese government could hold. They're looking for a little time. Nixon came into office, I think, determined to find some way to get out of there, but we sure took a lot of casualties while he was trying to determine a way to get out of there. 20-some thousand kids were killed after he came into office. He announced Vietnamization in June of 1969, and a few weeks earlier he said we're not seeking a military victory. In truth, we'd never been seeking a conventional military victory in Vietnam. Johnson wasn't, even though he'd get into sort of his bluffing about come back and hang the old coonskin on the wall sort of rhetoric. He was, a few weeks after he sent the troops in, he gave a speech in which he promised the North Vietnamese if they would negotiate, he'd be prepared to invest $1 billion in the Mekong Delta reconstruction. It would be as grand as the Tennessee Valley Authority. by the time we were finished with it. He was looking, everybody thought we could make the North Vietnamese blink, quite frankly, and we just kept escalating. And the danger of wars like that, and we can see them today, is when you're not quite seeking a military victory, you're using a military to try to force. Nixon and Kissinger called it a game a few times, and I don't mean by that they literally thought it was a game. They knew people were dying there, but it was part of a much bigger chessboard. And Nixon was looking for this bigger chessboard. Kissinger was looking for I talk about their pushing back when the military in Vietnam wanted some more help during the Easter Offensive, and they wanted to bomb North Vietnam rather than send the air support in to protect the bases in the south, because they wanted to put pressure on North Vietnam. They were just, who held Dak To was not of great consequence to Nixon or Kissinger.
I think this might be a good place to close and continue the conversation one-on-one when you go up to get a book signed. Is that?
That'll be fine. And one thing, just FYI, I don't have great hearing anymore, so if you want me personally to inscribe your book, if you can help me with spelling or with names, and don't assume because you met me sometime that I'll remember exactly. I have a terrible time. That's why I miss having Susan here tonight. But thank you.